wonderful, wonderful presentations. Now, those of you who are outside, if you want to come inside, there's seats. You know, in my long years doing this kind of thing, I know that I need to stall a little bit before I open it up to the audience, because you all are trying to fashion a question and a comment. So, I'm going to start with one. I was reminded in a very strange way, in terms of all of your presentations, about a wonderful story that I heard, a true story, at least 15 years ago. It's about a Gullah song. You all know that story. The Gullah people, in a really rather revolutionary way, were able to hold on to some of the language, to some of the practices. And why? Because racism apart, economics came into play. Because their masters wanted rice cultivation more than they wanted to keep them apart. Often, Sierra Leonean people, Mende people, and other groups would be transported wholesale to South Carolina. And because of that, they maintained a language, and they made it into a kind of patois with English. A friend of mine who was a Fulbright scholar years ago in Sierra Leone started to study the connection between the Gullah and Sierra Leone, and found, because of Lorenzo Dow Turner and his recordings, that there were several passages of a language that he thought was Mende. And somehow he came upon this woman in South Carolina who sang a song. You know about this. Who sang a song, and he said, Joe Apollo, my friend, that I need to trace this song to find out where it came from. And so after several years of talking with musicologists, linguists, by searching all over Sierra Leone, he and his group found a woman who knew this song and started singing it. And it was miraculous for him, because he thought he wouldn't find this particular source. But he found this woman, and then who sang the song almost perfectly. And the woman in South Africa didn't know the derivation of this song, but she sang this song that this woman in Sierra Leone heard, and the woman started translating it and started to cry. So Joe Apollo went to the priest of the area, a wise man. He said, what happened that this song survived the passage? What happened that it survived maybe 100 years? And the priest said, very simply, because it is the language we cry in. Wow. Wow. That language survived the Middle Passage, race, indignation. This is a general question, and everyone can take a stab at it. What do you see as the radical, revolutionary practice in language?
Well, I can start. I think one of the ironies of a lot of my writing is that it talks about family, and so even in the things that I have studied, I think I overlook a lot of the poets who are far more radical explicitly. You know, for example, I've written about Kofi Anidoko, for example, who writes a lot of dirges and poems of consolation, which are part of his Ewe tradition. But I think that the pressures to abandon language or to, when language is torn from you on either side of the Atlantic are epistemic violence. They absolutely are. And so all kinds of language work, whether it's preservation, experimentation, mixture, garbling, I mean, I think about Emrabisi's scattering on the page. I think all of those are ways to resist, and therefore, because they're the most intimate thing, the language you cry in is the language you never forget, but you figure out how to use it. That, I think, saving and building up of one's core and giving it as a gift outwards prepares other people to also kind of hold it together. And I know that sounds like a, maybe not resistance, but I mean, you know, like last week, Christine Blasey Ford, holding it together to speak for long enough to witness to a different kind of violence. I think that's maybe where I would see it, because holding on to language is one way, but also holding language out into other. Poetry does that in a way that prose doesn't in an obvious way. Yeah, that's what I think.
Wonderful. Improve on that.
Well, I'll just quote you, Cece, from your comments before, you know, at the end of your, it was interesting that both of you guys ended with like the challenge of, you know, heteronormativity. It was interesting that they turned that way. I'm kind of, and you know, that this is a moment where our language is dealing with that challenge, you know, prominently, you know, how we is, and I was thinking on what you were asking for African, you know, for the pre-colonial experience, et cetera, and you know, your question is English up to the task, right? And but we're asking, you know, is our English up to the task? But of course, you know, like the happy view of poetry is that the poetry has taken on that. That has been the task of poetry. Right? I mean, that is in many ways kind of its function, to work through and process that.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, question.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful set of talks that they really resonated together. I don't want to get too parochial, but I'm reminded by Cece's talk of a debate that Josephine and my Facebook friends were having the other day about a controversy over the Poetry Foundation did a feature. Did you see Tim Yu and Jennifer Chang's thing? Sorry, I'm not trying to be gossipy, but it really happened. Poetry Foundation did a survey, or a feature on Asian American poetry a few years ago, and it became controversial because they tried to call out the poets by their nation of origin, because they were trying to show a certain sensitivity and specificity to the different ethnicities within Pan-Asian Americanness, and a lot of the poets revolted and said, you know, like, why? Why is there a Chinese flag next to my face? Like, what does this mean? And so this was reflected for me in listening to Cece's talk about this question of perhaps a different history of language politics wrapped up in settler-colonialism versus immigration and assimilation politics, and whether that site you showed with the different African languages and the poets self-posting in them has a different valence and resonance to an Asian Americanist practice. And then it made me think of Nathan's question about like what are different forms of Pan-Africanism, what are different forms of Pan-Asian Americanism. is what's radical in one context, a preservation and a renaming and speaking in the mother tongue. Valence differently in another practice where there's so much baggage of Orientalism in the preservation of the heritage that runs counter to perhaps a radicalization of the mother tongue. So in Issei's, I mean, none of your poems were in Japanese, but in Issei's reclamation of Japanese poetics, not only doesn't resonate with Nisei or Pan-Asian Americanist politics, but also maybe dovetails better to like an Orientalist. Let's preserve the real Japan over and against the corruptions of Americanism, pidgin, so what works in one continent doesn't work in another continent, and then when you get into the global north and they're trying to do multiculturalism, they borrow from one practice to another and it doesn't work the same way. I was wondering if there were any thoughts about that.
I mean, I guess one issue is that Africa is a country. Yeah, of course, it's not a country. Africa is often mistaken for a country in the way people talk about it here, and so having national specificity, I think, is often more welcomed in African literature conversations. At the same time as people, and I've just been finishing up an article about the role of the nation in world literature, the way that Nigerian writers at once, they will say things like, Nigeria isn't a country. It was invented by the British. It's not real. There's no such thing as Nigeria, and yet they also don't question being called Nigerian writers. And so there's a sort of, but it then gets into very complicated things about ethnicity and language that Susie was touching on. So someone may identify as a Yoruba writer, and an African writer, and a Nigerian writer, all at the same time, and the different weight that they attribute to that will probably depend on where they are located.
Thank you, Sylvia, because I mean, obviously, my paper is about that kind of Asian American allergy to the Asian origins, and there are really important reasons for that. And it's interesting, kind of in contrast to African American experience, like this is a gross generalization, but you'll find, what might civilizational richness might be an aspiration for one group, but a liability for another, right? And so you might see a recourse to this great Chinese civilization, which actually is horrible for Chinese spirit. And it's actually very odd. But for me, I think I've been very invested in kind of historicizing that forever foreigner position for, and so I think it's important. Like in the 20th century, this country was fighting Asian nations over and over again, right? And so there was a very kind of historical, very recent, modern enmity, right? And that was a reason not to want. And so on the one hand, we have, culturally, I don't want to be, I'm American, I don't want to be connected to that. But on the other hand, like, they were the enemy if you were Japanese. You were incarcerated, right? I mean, there were like real consequences. And so there was a kind of enforced division, particularly through this kind of, we both work on this kind of 20th century. But having said that, I think if we go back to kind of the radical moment, that was like a third world moment, right? And so Asian American activists have sometimes not been attentive to the third world roots, precisely because of this particular kind of discomfort.
Wonderful. Yes.
Thank you all, that was wonderful. Just wanted to add to the Poetry Foundation thing, with also the muscle of the Poetry Foundation is a big part of the problem. I remember blogging for them. The last thing I did for them after I had checked out,
I hope not permanently.
Yeah, writing like a mic-drop essays, and saying, okay, you have an entry for Ansalzuba which has no poems, right? And which then has those awful like regional categories, and I actually published that in 2016, and it's still up. And she is, according to them, a U.S. Western poet in categorizations, right? So I wanted to ask you in that sense about the kinds of just trajectories and publication histories. Maybe I'm thinking of just how did how did these, Japanese American poets or Asian American poets in a moment before, right, the kind of institutional category, right, of ethnic studies as we understand it, and then in your case, what are the, I'm thinking of the obviously different valences, right, of publishing, right, in Africa, right, say in the UK, in the US, in the Caribbean, right, and how we social media tends to flatten these things out because everybody, I can have debates with people in Cuba, right, as which would have been unthinkable, right, so you have this sense that poetry economies are all the same. But really the same issues of who gets published, who gets distributed, how do works circulate, who has access to what, are pretty important. So I wonder if you could say something about either that theoretically or maybe logistically, how what routes and routes you took to just obtaining these materials and thinking about their circulation.
Well, I would say that the things that I presented today are all for the most part, limping along that sort of trajectory of flattening. In large, well, many things. One, like a lack of preparation on my part, in terms of leaving enough time to really, on the one hand, do field work, which is something that Nathan has been doing recently in Nigeria, in Uganda, and that's when you can go to local bookstores, meet poets who sometimes only carry their work with them to sell it, hear about things, go to readings, et cetera, et cetera. And so all of the ways that poetry is a small genre, right? It's small print runs, it's not something one can live off of, et cetera, et cetera. Those make its local communities so much more important, I would say, arguably, than for fiction. And so there are well, first of all, there are some long-standing presses. In many parts of Africa, they were educational presses, and so they still publish textbooks that are anthologies. For example, when I was in Zimbabwe last time, I was trying to work with folks on starting a poetry library, which is one of the things that African Poetry Book Fund is advocating. Now, they want to send a whole bunch of small press books from the US to start libraries there that will then expand people's minds to new sort of more experimental work, et cetera, et cetera. Exactly. So on the one hand, that sounds horrendous. On the other hand, there are no libraries that stock these books, and so indeed, there's kind of this gulf.
And many of those poets want to be reading.
Exactly,
US stuff,
exactly. Not because it's US stuff, but because they want to be part of the world, and they know that they are part of the world, and they know that some of the ways in which they have limited access because of the kind of economic collapse of many publishing houses and certainly bookstores, that this is a bridge. But the other intention of the African Poetry Book Fund is to make other African poets available, because I would say that even more than, say, global northern presses, it's the intra-African connections that are difficult to make. So that's one piece of it. In terms of the publishing too, there's both a help and a problem with these new prizes. On the one hand, they have been in some ways encouraged, in other ways raised the profile of other local and often national prizes. So for example, Uganda has one that was started by a woman who writes poetry herself, but that's not her primary profession. You have places like South Africa and Nigeria that have economies that can sustain a much bigger publishing industry. But then, say, Ghana next door, they have a publishing house, Afram, that publishes wonderful work, but it never circulates in the States. And then you have a publishing house like Africa World Press, which is not exclusively poetry, but technically has offices in Asmara, as well as in the US, that publishes smaller and less sort of fancy quality books. So there's that, and then one of the reasons that digital publishing, I think, really matters is that people access a lot of that on their phone. And so it's sort of a bridge between spoken word, which is huge, but doesn't necessarily travel between countries, and the written word, which isn't exclusively written in academic settings, but often is. I mean, someone like Harry Garuba waited a long time for his poetry to come out, but eventually it was in part because he had a certain international profile as well as a national community. So, but at the same time, you know, like when I was trying to figure out, first of all, do I have a second manuscript, and if I do, where would it get published, you know? I asked different people different things. Some folks said People Press in the UK, because although it started off as primarily Black, British, and largely Caribbean writers, they have a broader perspective than in the US for the most part. APBF doesn't do second books right now because they don't have the money and they're not sure how long they'll last. I was reluctant in some ways and also determined in other ways to send something to Kawikanam because I've never gotten into his workshop, et cetera, et cetera. You know, and then on the other hand, it's like, this is pushing a particular envelope if you're wearing your Africanness on your sleeve to say you want space in a community that has been so important for U.S. African-American experience. And those aren't officially separate. You know, like Blackness in America is very variegated by region, by class, by national origin, etc. But all of that makes it complicated to figure out if you do want to live in the book world, where do you do that, and who do you resign yourself to not reach it? I mean, my book in Zimbabwe is sold at the National Gallery of Art and maybe a couple other places, and they're largely places where people go who have US dollars as opposed to Zimbabwean bond notes. And I can't really control that because, well, I could if I was more willing to invest in it, you know, like to buy the books and myself as a gift, right? And I haven't quite done that yet, but maybe that's what I should do.
Maybe write it, they can do editions.
Well, that's
multiple
the
editions or
smart
something.
thing that other people who have done this before we do, is to negotiate to have multiple edition rights. I think maybe I need to follow your lead and have like Resistance kind of Staples magazine versions of things and to do more performance and that kind of thing. But sorry, that's a long answer.
Thank you.
Certainly, we have to give a shout out to Kwame Dawes for
Oh my
doing
gosh,
this,
yes, sorry.
this
I
important
can't
work,
believe I
doing this important work. And I was recently, just last month, in fact, in August, in Swaziland, which is now Eswatini. And Furious Flower was invited by the State Department. And at first I was wondering, should we go? You know, because obviously the State Department has an agenda. But we as poets realized that we could exercise our own agenda by going. So Frank Atswalka, Amiri Desha, Carrie Talley, Lauren Aline, and Damaris Hill. And I went to Eswatini. And we were able to find a group of poets down there who are hungry for our books of poetry. And so, and they're hungry to have an American audience. And so we're working on making that happen. But it was really remarkable to go there and understand that they live, of course, and they survive on the internet, you know, and they read the blog, you know, that Kwame Dawes does, and you know, it's just wonderful to see the connections that you can make. So it's, we are certainly transnational and international and all of that. Another question. Yes, Evie.
This is not a very well formulated question, but it's so striking to me to think about how much the conversation is turning at once on transnational kinds of connections and then sort of intra-national or generational disjunctions. And I don't know, it's really just an observation that is meant to open the door for you all to say anything that you're still thinking about.
Well, the conversation about publishing was also making me think about a conversation I had in Uganda this summer with Susan Chiguli, who's kind of she's the leading, say, mid-career poet in Uganda, an academic and literary. And a couple of things struck me about meeting her and talking to other people about it. So, everyone I talk to says Susan Chiguli, she's the best. But her reputation is mostly rests on a book that she wrote probably as a teenager, published 20 years ago in Uganda, so it's accessible, people can buy it, it's taught in schools. Her next collection was published in Germany, bilingual. You can get it in Uganda, but it's pretty expensive and rare, and she said a lot of people think it's like just a German translation of her book, but it's actually a new collection. And so there's that sort of, the way publication has it's been difficult, I think, for her to get newer work out, and hopefully we'll have a third collection soon. And then the poet who I think of as sort of the leading younger Ugandan poet, a guy named Nick Makova, has just had a book come out with People Tree in UK. It's fabulous. He lives in the UK, but he's come back to do workshops in Uganda, and she didn't know about his work. So there's also something about, even people who are, from my perspective, kind of the leading Ugandan poets of the moment, aren't necessarily talking to each other, partly because of where they live, partly because of these publishing structures that make it very hard to actually access books in print. And the emerging poets are definitely, on Twitter, reading, following the U.S. poetry scene on Twitter, but also hungry to get their hands on the collections.
I'll just say something about transnationalism, kind of left field, but there have been some kind of theories of flexible citizenship and transnationalism within particularly Asian diasporic communities, which have quite a troubling edge. And I would say, like, Exhibit A would be like the nightmare of crazy Asians, right? So, and there is like it's an interesting, somewhat, that there's a very kind of cosmopolitan and very powerful kind of transnationalism, which makes me want to just return to like kind of these kind of domestic politics, which I'm kind of really invested in. But it has been, I teach at a private university, and that crazy rich Asians are real. It's a very interesting question, really, about the place of a kind of Asian American political or even business sensibility, right? An Asian American sensibility that draws on U.S. experience. What is the place that, when I teach today to many of my students, I would say sometimes my students brilliant students from Singapore, from South Korea, who have perfect American English, for them, this is in fact more foreign than for white students who are born and bred here. So it's, the place of kind of Asian Americans, like in transnationalism, it's very vexing. And my sister is also an Asian American studies scholar. She's a sociologist. We're just like, associations.
Professor Chamberlain.
I've been heartbreaking privilege of knowing three speakers of languages who in the last among the last dozen or so speakers of their language. Jimmy Mullen in Northern Kootenai, Jacob Thomas, Cayuga, and Elsa Bowie and Luna Rui in Kalahari. And we're talking about the radical elements of language. Having a listener is right at the heart of what language is about. And what was, all three languages, the good news is all three languages are holding on as they try to get the young people, none of whom are first language speakers, for none of whom it is their first language. But it is coming back in each case. But one of the major problems for two of those languages, and in particular for the Khoikhoi language of Nunarui, is orthography. How do you find an adequate orthography for a language with 5 click sounds and 8 tones? That's not easy, and it's not easy for a whole bunch of indigenous languages in North America either. Not only because of those issues, but because of disagreements among the communities. And does that element figure in the thinking? First, finishing up, thank you so much for those lovely presentations. They were really inspiring. But it just came to mind as we were talking about the radical language.
Well, I'll say on the point of orthography, in Senegal there was an infamous fight that had major consequences, both economic and for the distribution of films, between Senghor, who was president, and therefore had disproportionate power, right, and Ousmane Sembène. Because Sembène, who was an incredible filmmaker, had spelled, and I'm going to blame it on the 3-month-old, but spelled the title of one of his works. I don't know if you know which one, but in a different orthography from the one that Senghor wanted to make the official and national one. That's a case in a language that was not Senghor's first language. It was in Wolof, right? Not Serer. But as a state language in many ways, not necessarily the official language, but still, there was this debate over control there. I think another instance in which the orthography thing comes up in languages that are more widely spoken is this question of tone. So for example, Solomon Paki, who was an early South African writer, early 20th century, was also a linguist and was very committed to preserving the proverbs, which are themselves a very poetic form of Setswana in print. And he encountered a number of missionaries who were involved in orthography because they were all writing the Bible in Setswana, and was appalled not as the first person, but as one of many who had heard missionaries get the consonants and vowels right, but mess up the tone to such an extent that they were making expletives in church. Right? So that question of tone really matters, and it's something that I think in the spoken word scene, one is able to kind of do something else with that. And spoken word in the parts of Southern Africa that I know the best is huge in terms of what the youth are doing. So coming back to Evie's question, the break in terms of generations is really marked, even when people are involved in more historical oral poetry forms, but also for people who had to really kind of push against the sort of traditionalism as its own form of resistance, and in often cases part of a post-independence and leading to independence. I will also say that in Zimbabwe, just because I have been very professional in this whole talk, there are a number of minority languages in which I've never seen a book. So for example, in Tonga or Dao, etc., I don't know what the status of written work is. And because they're not in the big cities, they're also not part of that scene. They are also preserving a very different sound. And so if they encounter folks who are more in the centralized part of Zimbabwe, it is a challenge to what's here, and a reminder of that kind of growth.
Wonderful. Look, I learned a word in Eswatini. You know, it's the only remaining kingdom in Africa. And I learned this word not from the poets that I had workshops with, but from the children. They took delight in teaching me some of their language. So here goes. Miyabonga. That's thank you. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience. Miyabonga. Thank you, Jahan and Peter, for arranging this wonderful symposium. And I'm going to be with you all day because I don't want to miss anything. I also want you all to thank our amazing panelists. And I want you to do this like you're doing it for the Center for Poetry and Poetics. I want you to do a rousing, thank you, a rousing Miyabonga. I